Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be that. I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, I'm no qua Osinachi. One lemon Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Mama Osinachi. Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be that. I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, I'm no qua Osinachi. One lemon Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, Mama Osinachi.
wọ́n kéré o, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa, àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be that. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. I'm no kwa, Osinachi. Money, Osinachi. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. Mama, Osinachi.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I greet you. We haven't begun officially, but good to see you, Papa Ale.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be that. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. I'm no kwa, Osinachi. Money, Osinachi. I'm watching. Daily, Osinachi. Mama, Osinachi.
Good evening if you're someplace where it's evening. Good afternoon if you're not, or good morning, or whatever. And welcome to this panel about Matt Brown's new book, Indirect Subjects. A handsome new book from Duke University Press, published last year. We are at the moment missing one of our panelists. Anulika Gina emailed me to say that she was in Asaba attending the funeral of her dean, and was going to try to get back to her hotel room in time to join us, but wasn't sure that that would work. The chairs of these book panels are supposed to begin by giving a very brief overview of the book. You know, presumably interpretive matters are to be left to the extremely capable roster of panelists we have with us today. And the chair is supposed to give the plain and simple version of what the book is about. That's singularly hard to do with this book, which is very intelligent. It has a whole lot of dimensions, and is very ambitious in intellectually across the board, and also in terms of its topic, which is conceived of in a very broad manner. About the same time I read this book, manuscripts came across my desk or my screen by two of Matt's sort of age mates among American Nollywood specialists, Connor Ryan and Noah Tsika. And I was struck by the fact that all three of these studies were unusually deep in their historical research, and all three of them were very concerned to see Nollywood in a perspective wider than the kind of classic period of Nollywood, which we date from 1992. They were all working in a very concerted manner with the celluloid film period, and also with Nigerian television. A lot of us have been making noise all along about the great influence of television especially, but also the cinema tradition on Nollywood. But there hasn't been a lot of serious work that actually filled that in and detailed it. And I'm very, very pleased to see that it's not Matt alone who's done that. But that is at the heart, or one of the things at the heart of his book. And this is work that's very hard to do because the materials are so hard to come by. A lot of them have disappeared, a lot of them irreparably. But nobody's ever taken this relationship more seriously than Matt does in this book, and he approaches this from a variety of angles. We get marvelous readings of Bossie and Company and Village Headmaster. We've got really valuable surveys of the careers of some key figures like Folletti and a few others. The book also makes a continued argument from which the title, Indirect Subjects, Nollywood's Local Address, comes, trying to analyze a facet of the post-colonial condition, which Matt names paraliberalism. That's his neologism, by which he means a condition of being in this relationship with capitalist modernity, in which you're sort of invited in, but also kept from ever being completely in, held at arm's length. A metaphor that he develops, really brilliantly in this book. Anyway, I am now going to be quiet and let the panelists do their work. We have an hour and a half. We're supposed to leave half an hour for general discussion. People, please ask your questions in the chat room, and we will get to them. Because there are so many of us, 5 panelists if Anulika manages to make it, and then Matt will be given a chance to retaliate. So you all will have 10 minutes, and after which you will be ruthlessly cut off at 9 minutes. I think I'll warn you, but please, you also be timing yourselves. Okay. So first up, Moradewan Adejumobi, who teaches at the University of California, Davis, has generated a lot of the most interesting thinking about Nollywood all along. If you haven't been reading her, you have reading to do. Please, Moradewan, take it away.
Thank you very much, John. I'll get to it. So in reading Mathew Brown's Indirect Subjects, I found a lot to agree with, which means that the task of addressing the author and his book is more complicated. That said, I will do my best. First, let me point out that on so many levels, Indirect Subjects opens up new directions in Nollywood studies. In fact, I would go so far as to describe this work as an example of Nollywood studies generation 2.0, or perhaps even generation 3.0. I say this because so much is already known about Nollywood's early years that one might reasonably wonder what else remains to be said that has not already been expressed by other researchers. And yet this is a feat that Brown manages to pull off in giving us a book that is not so much descriptive and narrative as highly analytical. Brown revisits many well-known features of Nollywood, but always from a new and original perspective. Several Nollywood scholars, like John mentioned, have previously noted Nollywood's indebtedness to Nigerian state television, especially at the level of shared personnel, whether one is thinking of future directors or prominent actors. But Brown goes further in helping us to understand how state television and commercial film ended up crafting a similar rather than oppositional mode of address to their often overlapping publics. The connections between the formal and informal sectors of Nigerian screen production likewise receive detailed analysis, enabling us to see the extent to which informal production, usually seen as being almost completely outside the purview of the state, has in fact been significantly shaped by the human and ideological resources of the state. This is an insight whose import goes far beyond the study of Nollywood and which has implications for our general approach to informality as a space of economic and creative activity around the African continent. Although Brown states that his primary interest is not in filling in historical gaps, the fact is he undoubtedly does fill in many gaps, thus making the work of future Nollywood scholars that much easier. Indirect Subjects, the title of the book, is fiendishly clever, referring us not just to the positioning of Nigerians somewhat outside the liberal world order, but also explaining how Nollywood goes about the business of representation by a process of indirection. Brown uses the term indirect subjects in at least 3 ways, possibly more. First, with respect to the colonial policies of indirect rule and periliberalism. Second, with respect to the subjectivity of characters in video, films, and television. And third, simply as with a commonplace understanding of the subject as a theme or topic, as for example, when he writes on page 154, and I quote, "The indirect subject of both End of the Wicked and Living in Bondage would be masculinity, which, though undeniably related to questions of economy, operates at a slight remove," end of quote. I found the general discussion of melodramatic modes of address in Nollywood especially informative and highly nuanced. The 2 chapters detailing the distinctions between the feminine and masculine melodramatic modes were, in my opinion, probably the 2 strongest chapters in the book. Let me also slip in here that Brown is particularly adept at delightful turns of phrase. As for example, when he writes that, and I quote, "Nollywood's masculine melodramas run on the constantly revolving question of whether an aspiring breadwinner would eliminate those for whom he would win bread in order to win bread," end of quote. One of the most important points that Brown makes, and which I think is important to highlight at a conference like the LSA, is the argument that we should not consider Nollywood simply as a direct reflection of events transpiring in Nigeria, though the filmmakers are obviously inspired to some degree by their experiences living in Nigeria. As I was reading Indirect Subjects, an example of Brown's claim that Nollywood does not so much reflect the goings-on in Nigeria as participate in the process of constituting Nigerian subjectivity presented itself to me. Many of you will recall the seeming state of confusion and political intrigue that pervaded the selection of a presidential candidate for the APC party in Nigeria earlier this month, and in the countdown to the emergence of a well-known politician as the presidential candidate. To describe the state of intrigue and backbiting at the party primaries, Premium Times, an online Nigerian newspaper, chose the following headline in reporting the story, and I quote, "APC House of Confusion," end of quote. An immediately recognizable reference for many Nigerians to the 1990s television serial, Amaka Igwe's Fuji House of Commotion. Yes, indeed, Nigerian screen media, including state television and commercial film production, as well as popular culture at large, often provide the discursive and analytical tools, if you will, through which Nigerians make sense of their everyday reality. One of the advantages of being invited to speak about a book in which you have been quoted at large is that you then have an opportunity to push back and ask questions. I'd obviously like to argue with Brown about whether we should consider Nigeria and other such societies as post-sacred in accounting for the overrepresentation of melodramatic narratives in popular culture. I take Zarzosa's point that melodrama is, and I quote, "a fundamental mode of human understanding that may become useful during certain historical moments, but does not have an easily documented history," end of quote. And in that sense is a universal mode, obviously not limited to Europe. I'm willing to concede that we don't have to agree with Peter Brooks and the way in which he accounts for melodrama. However, I wonder about the extent to which the majority of early Nollywood melodramas made the state as equal a partner with the sphere of the occult in determining the outcomes of decisions taken by the protagonists in these films. In any case, I think there is room here, following Brown's book, for having a more extended debate about melodrama and what is at stake in thinking about the interface between the state, as well as the formal sector in general, and the sphere of the occult in different kinds of Nollywood melodrama. In his analysis of the epic genres in Nollywood, and there was a discussion about epics in an earlier panel today, that he sees as partially descended from NTA's adaptation of Achebe's Things Fall Apart, Brown makes much of the fact that the English language films that we describe as epic often invest Nigerian societies that were not known to historically have had kings and royal bloodlines with kings and queens. This raises some questions. In as much as the NTA adaptation starring Pete Edochie and the Nigerian government's own commitment to recreating new forms of indirect rule may have provided a great deal of the impetus for the epics, I wonder if an additional source for these kingly narratives may not have been overlooked. Is it not also possible that Yoruba traveling theatre and later Yoruba television staging of a sovereign past, not to forget Herbert Ogunde's films, were also precursors to, if not elements that gave inspiration to what would later become the epic genre? And this brings me to another point, though I recognize that this was outside the scope of Brown's study. How would you characterize the films in Yoruba and Edo, for example, that recreate a distant past that does have historical antecedents and contemporary correlates? Would you describe such films as versions of the epic or historical dramas following the conversation in the earlier panel this morning? Would you describe them as also partaking in a Gothic sensibility? What are films in indigenous languages set in the contemporary period, but where magical powers are at work? Should we see them also as films preoccupied with the male breadwinner ideal? And to what extent are the remakes and sequels of early melodramas like the new Living in Bondage and the new Neka the Pretty Serpent also preoccupied with the male breadwinner ideal, if not with periliberalism? I have many more questions to ask. I had to cut my presentation into 3, so this is 1/3 of it. One of the great takeaways from the book is Brown's observation that, and I quote, "liberalism seems to desperately need and therefore to actively reproduce its outside, conceptually and materially in order to endure," end of quote. In Indirect Subjects, Brown makes a fully convincing case for why we should read Nollywood from this perspective. Before ending, I want to return to the opening pages of the book, where Brown identifies many mentors and pays homage to his foremost teacher, Teju Olaniyan, who, as we know, sadly left us in 2019. I would like, in concluding my review of Indirect Subjects, to pay homage to the brilliant student who has masterfully extended the kind of incisive approach to Nigerian popular culture modeled by his foremost teacher. Well done, Matt Brown. Well done. John, you're muted. John, you're muted. Can you hear us?
I can hear.
Excuse me, I was just congratulating you on your timeliness and promising to refund you your lost minute if you want it later on. Next up is Tony Ada, who is a professor of film studies at Minnesota State University in Moorhead. He is recovering from COVID, I understand, but we're very glad to have him with us. He's the author of a lot of articles about African cinema. He's also been working on indigenous cinema in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. That has a book manuscript in the works on that subject. He will also be giving a presentation at Pan-African University, part of their Filmmakers Forum, on Saturday. A year ago, he had a Fulbright, which he spent there at Pan Atlantic University. Tony.
Right. Thank you. I'm honored to be in this panel. I just want to make one slight correction to John's beautiful introduction there. I think in this panel, as we have it, I'm the least published on Nollywood and African cinema. My central focus of publication is indigenous filmmaking. And as John said, I focus on indigenous filmmaking from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. I also want to say, as part of introducing myself to the panel, that I'm more of an observer of Nollywood scholarship at this point. Let me put it that way. But on top of that, when I look at texts such as this one and many others, the first question I ask myself is, okay, how can I teach with this? Who am I going to give this text to read, right? And so the question of access is very important to me in the production of scholarship. So in going through the book, though, without repeating some of the comments that have been made already, I need to reiterate, though, that it is quite an ambitious text. And just to repeat Maradone's comment, it just opens up a whole range of areas to explore, moving forward. But what I did with it really was, to go back to really sort of focus on that first chapter and look at, okay, so what are the agenda, that Matt Brown set out to achieve in the text. And I sort of outlined 5 of these very quickly. I'm just going to go through them without detail. 1, why did Nollywood construct the type of subject created in the state's model of representation? 2, he wanted to articulate the structural conditions within which subjects are imagined and to which they may at the same time contribute and participate. Thirdly, to explore sort of exploration of the spheres of formal as opposed to informal modes of production. The formal being related to the state and the informal more related to Nollywood's mode of production, where the focus is on economics and entertainment. 4th, and this for me was probably the highlight of the book, exploration of audiovisual, formal, and stylistic features, and what those might say about the politics of culture in Nigeria. I think for me, this is the strength of this book. It is what I always look for in studies of Nollywood or writings about Nollywood. You know, I always hunger for and, you know, seek out, you know, a move from just sociological analysis of films without actually talking about the textual, the filmic elements of the material itself. And I think this book does very well in doing that. Now, finally, the fifth sort of objective in the book is to introduce new terms and meanings, to quote in here, new terms and meanings to the critical lexicon associated with Nollywood. And here, Maradin already mentioned some of these, but the terms such as cinema of preference, cinema of imposition, the feminine and masculine melodramatic modes sort of come to mind immediately. The strength, I've mentioned sort of like the big moment for me in the text, his exploration of stylistic analysis to get at meanings or to reach other conclusions. But one of the other things that stood out for me, and I think John sort of introduced this earlier on, is just the range, depth, and interpretation of archival material. And I just found that astonishing. The unpacking of Greville's footage, for instance, and that material's participation in the Imperial Project during the British Empire exhibition, that for me was really, it was brilliant. It was brilliantly done. Other examples, the exploration of the context of the village headmaster. I thought these and many others in the text just left me sort of, you know, mouth agape, like how much time and resources and intellectual rigor did this guy pour into the writing of the book. Now, for me as a researcher and teacher, the text offers theoretical positions worth testing elsewhere, especially because my work is comparative. When I look at texts like this, I wonder, okay, what else can I do with this, right? Outside of Nigeria. So how might some of the book's core periliberal claims, for instance, be mobilized in other previously British colonies? It's a question I ask myself, you know, like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, or perhaps more directly to my own scholarship. How would periliberalism be utilized to explain Aboriginal Australian cinema, or Maori New Zealand cinema, or First Nations Canadian cinema? What about territories of some of these colonies, such as Screen Media in Papua New Guinea, which was a territory of a colony of Britain? All right. Now, the final question that I have is, how does the concept of periliberalism play into current debates around the presence of Netflix in Nollywood? That's where I'll stop for now.
You people are giving me very little to do as enforcer of time. Thank you, Tony. Next up is Anulika Ajina, who has managed to join us. She teaches at Pan Atlantic University. was on leave for a while to spend a couple of years taking part in the African Screens grant, the Linda Way Dovey got from the European Research Council. Anulika is a co-editor along with Linda Way and Michael Thomas of the resulting volume, which a couple of us have contributed to in a small way. I think that's going to be a really important book. Anyway, Anulika.
Hello, and thank you for the introduction. My name is Angulika Agina, and yes, I teach and research Nollywood at the Pan-Atlantic University, and I hope you can hear me. Thank you to the organizers of this conference, and thank you particularly to Sahid, who invited me to work on this panel. Many thanks, of course, to Mathew Brown, who's written this book and given us something to talk about today, to the chair of a panel, to fellow panelists, and of course, to the audience listening to us. The title of this book, Indirect Subjects, is something I found striking. I questioned before opening the book if Nollywood's local address means a site of production or a mode of speaking or telling or showing. It sparked my curiosity as one is not immediately sure if the word address should be read as a noun or a verb, but that is soon clarified in the early pages of this 8th chapter book, 8 because I include the intro and the conclusion. The first paragraph of the acknowledgements page also struck me remarkably. It's one of the very few times that an author recognizes and writes humbly about his own positionality when representing people and works different from what he is more familiar with, and which leads me to make the concluding remarks at the end of this review. Indirect Subjects is rich in its development of a background and historization of Nollywood, and is a very important contribution to African screen studies and popular culture, particularly to Nollywood's modes of representation of how Nollywood speaks, to whom it speaks, and why it speaks in the way that it does. It adeptly addresses the social contexts into which films are addressed and to which they are addressed, and draws parallels with the British colonial system of indirect rule. I found this book interesting because all of the things that it puts forward have been dealt with in previous texts and in varying degrees before, such as Nollywood's historical links to theater and television, the representation of women, masculine gaze, Nollywood's comic and epic genres, the glamorization or condemnation of advanced fee fraud, or even specifically the aesthetics of outrage in Brian Larkin's work. And this is acknowledged by the author while at the same time challenging previous texts, calling for and justifying alternative readings of Nollywood films through the lens of free indirect subjectivity. Brown directs our attention to new ways of reading the logic of Nollywood's aesthetic, socio-political, and economic realities as a break from, and at the same time, an extension to the liberal world order. His robust analysis moved from images of a personal and the domestic to the social and public in ways that are distinct and at the same time fluid, leading him to conclude in his discussion of gender that gender may be a retrogressive construct, but taken together, Nollywood's feminine and masculine modes of address suggest that the power of gender can transcend family and even nation to engender power of a much greater sort. So the personal motivations feed social organizations, and those in turn redound to satiate and amplify individual needs and ways of seeing in what he christens periliberalism and free indirect subjectivity. The author's use of textual analysis and intertextuality to plumb the depths of meanings and subjectivities embedded in and derived from the film texts and the larger Nigerian society is simply admirable and was a huge delight to read. I loved how he presented the films as being in conversation with one another, peeling back the layers of meaning from older films and deepening the narratives of newer ones. I loved his assessment of a typecasting that is so prevalent in and has become formulaic to Nollywood. Brown's book is interested in the intersections of formalized state television and informality of a Nigerian film industry known as Nollywood. This relationship has obviously been identified, and the history of Nollywood, I would say, is indeed incomplete without acknowledging these foundations laid by the television practitioners of the time. But Brown has deepened our understanding of this link, showing, among other things, how the concept of indirect rule, Britain's system of colonial governance, runs parallel to and at the same time is adjacent to Nollywood's mode of addressing subjects, thus delivering previously unseen aesthetics of Nigerian screen media, and also developing the concept of periliberalism as the idea of a simultaneous close and distant address of screen actors and spectators. I sort of had a love-hate relationship with this book, for want of a better expression. I loved it for pushing the boundaries of what we know about Nollywood in forms of analysis stretching out in multiple temporal directions, coupling state television with Nollywood, literary works with film texts, colonialism with post-colonialism, and the different aspects of subjectivities in addition to the various ways of mirroring the society. And I disliked it, well, in inverted commas, because of the skill with which he wrote about Nigeria, my Nigeria. It was so accurate. So what we would say in Nigeria, so on point at times, that I thought, how could he bring such rigor to this work, such deep knowledge of Nigeria? And in dealing with my relationship with this book, I tried to put it in the form of a question. Does this book suggest that local address implies that Nollywood talks only to Nigerians alone? Or is it speaking only about Nigerians' lived experiences? What about other Africans in the continent and elsewhere for whom Nollywood stories resonate strongly and who actually claim that the films represent their own lived experiences? This book, Indirect Subjects, reads very much like a sequel to John Haynes' creation of a Nigerian film genre, a kind of second installment similar to Nollywood's serialization of films, but I missed the "To God be the glory." I can't end my review without also asking what plans there are for this book to reach Nigerian scholars and students who are based in Nigeria. I would like to suggest and plead for that to be considered so that this deeply theorized and well-written book will not be the fruit of yet another extractive operation wherein those who have participated directly or indirectly in the narratives that unfold in Nollywood films will be excluded from accessing it or may have to pay heavily for it. But please disregard this comment if that is on the way, if that is already on the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelika. Our next panelist is Alessandro Jedlowski, father of 2 young children, a researcher at Sciences Po in Bordeaux, somebody who's produced a massive research, much of it with a comparative or internationalist dimension to it. I mean, he's written a lot about Nollywood, but also about film industries elsewhere in Africa, in Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, and so on and so forth. He's also explored the involvement of China in media in the African continent and many other subjects. He's trained as an anthropologist. Alessandro.
Thank you very much, John. And I join the others in thanking, of course, the organizer, Said particularly, but of course, and most of all, Mathew, for this book, which I really loved. So well done, Mathew. I think you did an amazing job. And the book is well researched, well written. It's really a pleasure to engage with it. And it contributes in original ways to the Nollywood scholarship, as the others have already said, opening up the space for new lines of research and debate. In particular, I appreciated the historical perspective adopted in this work. I don't want to repeat what others have said. I'll try to keep short this introductive part, but I need to say that, as John was saying, I mean, and I'm happy to know, thanks to John, that others have also engaged in this historical perspective, but your book is the first in a way of this group of upcoming book that I read, and I'm really happy to read this depth of historical perspective and the possibility that you give us to get to know all this incredible archival material, as Tony was saying, that you collected over, it must be acknowledged, more than 10 years, I would say 12 years of research. In your book, you mentioned the beginning of your research in 2010, which is fun for me because it was more or less the same time, and we didn't have the chance to meet in Nigeria at the time. Interesting and thought-provoking is, for me, your main theoretical proposal, which suggests that Nollywood-specific forms and styles, and more precisely, its use of modes of free indirect subjectivity, constitutes Nollywood spectators into a unique kind of publics, what you suggest to call indirect subjects. I will shortly try to summarize this concept the way I read it, even if the others already somehow did it. In order to define this concept, you find inspiration in both political history and film studies, connecting scholarship on colonial modes of administration, the indirect rule, to works on specific modes of cinematic addressivity, the works on free indirect subjectivity. And to try to summarize your formulation in the shortest way possible, one can say, using some of your words, that we can understand Nollywood spectators as publics that see with third-person eyes and hear with first-person ears, a bit like colonial subjects who, because of the specific colonial modes of administration applied to them, saw modernity from a distance with third-person eyes, but felt the consequences of this distance directly with first-person ears. Through the analysis of Nollywood forms and styles, then, you offer us a theory of modernity and liberalism, which confirm the centrality of colonial territories in the liberal project, but suggest us to consider their marginality as the result of the formulation of a specific system of colonial governmentality, indirect rule, designed to keep colonies and later independent post-colonial states at arm's length distance from the social, political, economic benefits of belonging to the to the liberal world. That is to keep them, as you say, with coining a new word, in this very liberal dimension. Throughout the book, you offer also several other interesting theoretical propositions, such as your fascinating discussion of the terms of feminine and masculine melodramatic modes of address, or the analysis of some Nollywood films in relation to the concept of sovereignty, something that I found particularly interesting also because I've been working lately around this concept, and even if in quite maybe different ways from the way you're doing it here. However, considering the little time that is at my disposal, I will focus on the main concept of the book, the concept of indirect subjects, to ask a few questions and put together a few remarks. I already say how much I enjoyed reading the book and how relevant I consider its contribution. So now I'll play a bit the devil's advocate to open up the discussion. A first remark concerns your emphasis on the colonial period and on indirect rule to develop your theory of Nollywood's film's addressivity. Despite the interesting results that this focus produces, I wonder if it is entirely accurate in historical terms to assume that indirect rule had the same impact throughout Nigeria, and particularly in a city like Lagos, the cradle of Nollywood and of television series production, where the colonial administration operated more directly than in other regions of the country. Again, I'm not an historian, but it's just, it was striking to me because I tend to associate indirect rule very much to the North, even if, of course, it has been applied elsewhere. But specifically in connection to Lagos, I was questioned. I also wonder if other historical moments in Nigerian history, such as the Biafra War, the oil boom, or the economic and political crisis of the 80s, did not have also a very significant role in shaping the modes of address of this film industry, together, of course, with the colonial period. But in this sense, for as much as I find the idea of indirect subject fascinating, I also wonder if it doesn't risk somehow to homogenize a bit the otherwise very diverse universe of Nigerian audiences and its historical, cultural, and social dynamism. In this sense, I find Karen's Barber propositions about the addressivity of Nigerian popular culture production very useful. And somehow I wonder if, maybe during the discussion later, you could engage a bit more directly with Karen's work in relation to yours. Specifically Karen's work on addressivity as formulated in the Anthropology of Text and Public. For instance, Karen warns us, and I quote, that though new kind of public undoubtedly emerged across Africa from the 19th century onward, this was not a before and after type transition where one mode displaced the other. Rather, there was a multiplication of modes constituting textual meaning and imagining community. And the introduction of these new modes was always experimental, piecemeal, partial, hybrid, and subject to complications. The role of print, which Karen focused more closely on, and subsequently the electronic media in the constitution of a national imagined community was only one strand in a history that included the simultaneous consolidation of local ethnic and other identities and the imagining of supranational communities, end of quote. Further down in the same chapter, she underlines how, and I quote again, new imagined constituencies did not necessarily coincide with nation. In the formative years of multi-ethnic, multilingual, externally defined nations of Africa, emergent classes of literati experimented with the new genres of print capitalism in order to convene shifting publics, whose boundaries seemed to shrink and expand from moment to moment, sometimes consolidating ethnic linguistic communities far smaller than a nation, and other times bypassing the nation to convoke a Pan-African, Black, or Pan-human audiences, end of quote. This consideration seems to be, at least in my view, relevant also in what concerns Nollywood. In particular, Karen's formulation gives us the opportunity to bring to light the fluidity and complexity, the historical openness to transformation, and multiplicity that characterizes the processes of formation of publics in Nigeria. A number of attributes that appear less prominently, maybe, or at least to my understanding, in the formulation of indirect subjectivity. So I wonder, and that is one of the questions I throw on the table, how does the concept of indirect subjectivity, how can we open up the concept of indirect subjectivity so as to integrate in its formulation the incredibly rapid transformability of the Nigerian society, the fact that this society is so dynamic that, I mean, well, it's resists definition somehow. Still on the issue of Nollywood's modes of address, I have another, maybe more methodological remark. I entirely agree on the importance of working toward the analysis of theoretical publics created by the specificity of Nollywood's forms and styles. But at the same time, I concur with what Mathew, what you wrote together with Nyasha Mboti a few years ago in an essay titled Nollywood's Unknowns. We still know too little of what Nollywood's audience really do with the films they consume. During the few research experience that I had with Nollywood's audience, I got the feeling that things are quite complex. For instance, especially during the early years of Nollywood, before the advent of multiplex and streaming platforms, people often did not reach the end of the film. There were and still are power cuts or previously overlooked obligations often made and probably still make people turn the TV set off or leave the screening venue before the end of the film. This means, and I'm using here materials from a previous piece of work I did on this stuff, but this means that while the films have specific modes of address and strong pedagogical imperatives, as you rightly define them, people watch them in a variety of different situations, which very often oblige them to interrupt the viewing and leave the narrative of the film they were watching wide open. What does this mean for a theory of addressivity of the kind proposed here, and in general terms, for a theory of addressivity, if we want to try to build one up? shouldn't we try to combine our understanding of the theoretical publics that Nollywood constitute with a closer analysis of what publics actually do, what publics actually do emerge from specific reception practices? I'm perfectly aware of the countless difficulties of conducting audience research, but I still think, as several Nollywood scholars have underlined in the past, that in-depth qualitative research on Nigerian audiences, on the reception of Nollywood films, and of a myriad of other media products would be incredibly useful to give us a stronger sense of the worldviews and forms of subjectivity that Nollywood helps to shape. In Mathew's book, in your book, the reader gets the feeling, and this is maybe my feeling, that you have a view of Nollywood's political dimension that is a bit pessimistic. At one point, you write, and I quote, that linking Nollywood's modes of address to those of the gatekeeper state suggests that Nollywood contributes to a form of social organization that makes it possible to endure periliberalism. I partly agree, but again, play the devil's advocate. If I understand you well, Nollywood's forms and style contribute in perpetuating Nigerians' peripherality in the world order, and they somehow participate in the ideological project of periliberalism. Despite you underlining elsewhere in the book the relevance of Nigerian audiences and producers' agency in this equation, I feel that this view, again, in my perception, might be a bit static and risks to overlook both directors' intentions and the dynamic ways in which Nollywood audiences react to the film that they watch. In my research experience with the audience again, especially with popular audiences in video clubs and living rooms, I observed that Nigerian audiences consume films in ways that are far from passive. Often heated debates erupt during film screenings, practically interrupting the film or transforming it in the background noise of a strong and vivid exchanges among audience members. In my view, then, what makes Nollywood films particularly successful, and all Nollywood films more than recent releases maybe, is their capacity to ask moral questions that matter to the local viewers, rather than offering didactic resolutions or ideological prescriptions. What matters more is the question rather than the answer, in my view, again, from what I did, I saw in my research. So again, I really enjoyed reading the book, and this is why also I could come up with remarks, comments, and I could continue far longer, and precisely because I think this is a great thought-provoking book and such a wonderful contribution to Nollywood studies that open up the room for us to have many more exchanges and debates. Thank you again, Mathew, and next in the line. I don't know.
Next in the line is Onowakome, who I think in this context really needs no introduction. He's, been in Nollywood studies since the very beginning. No one has done more than he has to create Nollywood studies as a discipline, and I think no one has done as much as he has to establish it as a community through the many conferences that he's organized and the editing he's done and so on. So Ono, please.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. The good thing about being the last to make such presentation is that you really have nothing else to say because all been said. So what I'm going to be doing, it's simply to be the provocateur and to ask a couple of questions because a lot has been said about this book. But just before I go there, I should say quite clearly that when this manuscript was sent to me, I had the feeling that I had read something like this before. I mean, it was a nagging feeling, and I said, so where is this coming from? I got to know why later. The publishers actually sent it to me. And I was just thinking about how to respond to it. But at that time, I had problems, so I couldn't do what I was supposed to do. My brother died, and so I had to go back to Nigeria. But one of the things I learned, just reading the book for the very first time, is the sophistication of the argument. And what that told me then and still now is that Nollywood studies has indeed grown. So we're not repeating the whole idea, which was the case in the early 2000s about Nollywood came from this, Nollywood came from that, Nollywood was this and that. There is in this book a generation, it's a creation of a new kind of interpretation for Nollywood, which I found fascinating. I will come to the peri-liberalism thing later, but I found this fascinating because it just presented a new kind of reading, especially the reading that has to do with connecting the audience in a very special way. In one of those really, really memorable lines I have right here on my note, you talked about the spectators participating in the activities on the on-screen characters as a process of knowing themselves, as a process of becoming part of that history of the characters, the history and economic circumstances of the characters that they deal with. This is really, really important for me. It's something that I've been also dealing with, like really trying to understand the ways that this new audience, to quote Baba, how this new audience emerged and what they do with the materials that they get. But actually, that's part of the problem that I have with the text. The bad thing about these kinds of presentation is that we cannot change what is in the text because it's set. So it's already set. We cannot do anything about that. But let me just quickly go through some of the great things that I like about the book. Your discussion actually of melodrama, right? Especially just thinking about melodrama from the perspective of Peter Brooks as the disruption of an organic society, the cultural, the disruption of cultural communities and so on and so forth. That is, for me, really, really interesting. It's interesting because lately I've also been in touch with some of the early people to work at the NTA. And I interviewed at length Peter Igo, who was the programs manager for some time. And one of the things I learned from that interview is how this peri-liberalism actually emerged from, not just from the economy, not just from the really, really difficult political situation, but from the activities of people within NTA. And so he talked about the fact that, say, new village headmaster became new village headmaster, not because that was going to be the case, but because someone at the NTA, for different reasons, decided to import American and Mexican and Brazilian soap operas to replace all of this really, really interesting Nigerian soap operas, which is very popular. And in fact, the argument that he made to me was that this was the period that Nigeria was actually creating a nation out of these dramatic forms were actually creating a nation were in the process of creating one nation, and then that was truncated. So I take it from reading your book that it is not just the economic situation, but the devious attitude of some of us. Perhaps you could link that to the economic situation. I don't know. It's possible to do anything with an intellectual interpretation, but this is a more direct, really direct reference that he gave to me, and I like that. So the point here is that the soap opera, the so-called melodrama is not that you talked about, which you mentioned quite a bit. It's not something that came directly only from the influence of traditional or economic circumstances, but also from the importation of cultural items, cultural artifacts, such as The Rich Also Cry, for instance, and all of these films that came in the late 1970s and early 80s. In other words, your analysis is really fantastic, and I liked it. The other point I took out from your book has to do with the point that you vigorously tried to make, and you made it really well. Which is, and this is a point that I think that John has made over and over again, and which I have tried to make to many Nigerians, especially the intellectual class, once they knew that I was interested in Nollywood, and they'll ask me, why are you interested in this nonsense? It does not reflect real life. And you made the point about, now it is not a matter of Nollywood actually reflecting life. It's not a direct reflection of life. This is the first time that any such serious attempt, well, not the first time, but the latest of that attempt, because as I said before, John had made this, and I think that we touched on it in that joint essay that I spoke about in the panel this morning. So that's very convincing. But perhaps the most important thing for me is to move the discussion away from Nollywood study to screen studies. It's really important, so that there is a historical connection, so to speak, between all three facets in a sense, right? Television, the early films, which I also studied, the Yoruba films, even though that wasn't done very well in the book, but it is not something that you may have considered as part of the project. But the connection to TV, it's really fascinating. So for just this once, we can go back and say, look, there's a book where you can actually read and make this connection between these screen cultures. I'm also very taken by your analysis of one of Nollywood's evergreen, Living in Bondage. So it is no longer, oh, this man killed this man, killed this wife and takes this wife there and that, and then the ghost is pursuing this man. But it's given a very critical dimension, a very critical texture, as you discuss the idea of parallelism and also masculine melodramatic instances in Nollywood. I really like that. You as one of those who consumed Village Headmaster, I was old enough actually to be part of this audience, consuming Village Headmaster. We go back home every time it's on screen. It was really important. And I wonder where you got the tips to do this, because I tried once and they said, oh yeah, we tipped on one, or we tipped on this and we tipped on that, and so we So it is wonderful to know that you were able to do this. You know, it's the benefit of being an outsider coming into subjects like this. It's one benefit that some of us don't have because they look at you as a rabble rouser and get away, we won't give you this stuff, you know. But it's really nice that someone has done that. Now, and here are some of the things I'd like you to address, probably if you want to, but you shouldn't if you don't want to. Now, the idea of free indirect subject, third person, first person, and the combination of both, seems to me a very hegemonic way of constructing these subjects, as if they must all be one. They think the same way. They behave the same way, even though they come from the same economic and political background. Can they really do this? Can this really be true? I understand where you're coming from and all the great guys that you quoted, but they too have been challenged in one way or the other. I'm trying to remember some of the guys that you quoted here. And how, for instance, is your idea of peri-liberalism consumed across Africa? And as it relates to screen images, right? And across the African diaspora. It may not be a subject, but maybe someday you want to think about this. How will they consume this kind of cultural material, given that they're not actually privy to the cultural and political context of can we apply that to this huge chunk of Nollywood audience in that respect? And this is something that I had a very hard time trying to think through. But of course, I'm not saying that your book should have done this. I'm just saying that I'm just trying to imagine if it did, and then it would be, of course, too big, but at the same time, it would be something that will have given us a broader perspective of this extremely beautiful adaptation of the idea of peri-liberalism that you deal with in this text. Now, the other one that I want to talk about is something that I've always grappled with since that 1994-96 conference, which we did at the University of Bayreuth. And because in a sense, the whole idea of peri-liberalism is connected to your description of the Gothic in the so-called epic film. And I'm wondering, what is Gothic? The question is, what is actually Gothic about the epic film? The reason why I bring this up, if this was the first time that I've seen it, I wouldn't bother at all. But in the special issue of Post-Colonial Text, which I edited, there is also another reference to the occult video film as what's the English, what's the Western formulation for that now?
Horror.
Horror as the horror film, and in an informal setting. And I was talking with Tobias Vendel, who did the essay. Again, it's a very wonderful essay. You cannot fault it, right? But can you really read it as a horror film? The way that Dracula is, can you? When you dealt with the idea of the melodrama, one of the things, because again, I've been walking around that too, one of the things that I found that Nollywood added to that discourse is the occult, so that the melodramatic injected into its discourse in Nollywood the presence of the occult. And so that the occult becomes really, really part of that melodramatic sequence in all the films, even when it is not manifest in the actual film, the film itself. References are often made to that. And this is something that I think that Nollywood has contributed to that discourse, the fact that you can link it to the other world, the world of the metaphysics. Finally, yes, okay. Finally, there is, you talk a whole lot about the audience, but there is something that you didn't talk about, that in early Nollywood, actually, the audience was part of the making of that subjectivity directly. So a man comes, gives you money to make the films, and then he says to you, put this character here, put my girlfriend here, put my wife here, right? So he becomes part. This is quite different from what you talked about in the book, but it's a very crucial part of the making of subjectivity. And in a sense, even in Netflix films, this is also the case, because I just finished talking with R&D, who came to Canada recently, and he
I have to cut you off. I'm getting a message from LSA conference, ground control, warning that we have less than 30 minutes left.
Yeah.
And Matt has not yet responded. We're supposed to leave 30 minutes for questions from the audience. Please, if you have questions, and I hope you do, very few of them have accumulated in the chat, but I think that's the place to put them. I'm not sure that things are hooked up so that if you raise your hand, on the screen, anything happens. Somebody might try that, but anyway, please, those of you who are tuned in, please do pose questions to Matt in the chat section. Meanwhile, Matt, if you would respond to what's been said so far.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to respond to everything. I don't think that's possible. I am incredibly humbled and honored and overwhelmed by the attention to my work. I mean, critical attention is still attention, and I can't believe the amount of attention that these scholars that I have so much esteem for have paid to my work. So thank you again. Thank you to Jonathan for chairing this session. Thank you to each of the presenters. Thank you to the LSA and to Sahid for organizing. I've taken notes, very copious notes, and I could perhaps try to go through things one by one, but again, I think I'd be here for an hour trying to address each thing. Let me say that there's one sort of theme emerging from some of the critical reflections about audiences and understanding the way that audiences actually work, how that relates to the ways that I've tried things. It's not the first time I've gotten this kind of question, especially from anthropologists, and I take it to heart. I mean, also I know that Agina has done some really great work on audience studies, and it's one of the reasons that I tried to word things very carefully in my book to say that what I was interested in is the way that Nollywood addresses itself to what it imagines to be a local audience, so not necessarily the diasporic audience or the Pan-African audience, and that really interested in trying to connect that mode of addressing, imagining an audience addressing itself to that audience, to these larger power structures, the state, the global political economic system. And that was a lot to work with on its own. I also don't have the training and the expertise and the orientation to do very detailed audience studies. It's not that I don't value it. and not that I wouldn't want to, but I found that even the small ways in which I've tried, have been in some ways kind of disastrous, because I believe that it does take real training. And I think, it means having a degree in these kinds of fields. But so my intention at the end of the day was to, try to fully and faithfully describe a mode of address that others, as Professor Ada said, could test, ideas that could be tested. Is it true that audiences understand things in the way that we've set them up? I also, I really liked the comment that this was, maybe Nollywood Studies 3.0, or that this was a sequel to Professor Haynes's book, which is in some ways I would agree. I felt like I was adding layers to things that he was saying. But one of my intentions, again, with the book was to open up lines of debate, to say things that hadn't quite been said before, even though I'm talking about archives that, as people have said, we already know some of these things to be the case. But if we look closely again, if we actually pull out the text that we've only talked about but not actually delved into fully, what new insights might we find? And the general idea that many of us, or many of you, my my senior colleagues and those I look up to, have been saying truthfully, of course, for a long time, the way that Nollywood is so close to its audiences, the way that it represents a grassroots, innovation, and has been able to surpass and bypass, state and global political economic structures in certain ways. I wanted to add to that discussion, I wanted to bring back certain questions about power, about how even though those things are true, there may be ways in which larger power structures still organize those activities. Even though I agree that audiences are important to look at and to think about the ways that they react to texts, the fact of the matter is that we're talking about reactions. There's no reaction without the text itself, the way that the text organizes that attention and so on. So I understand that I'm telling just part of the story, and I would rely on my colleagues with different kinds of expertise to look at other parts of that story. If power organizes attention in a particular way, and if that power organizes the way that screen media address their audiences, then in what ways do different powers and different kinds of agency interact? There is a kind of, I won't go on too long, but there is a kind of older argument in a sort of like globalization and anthropology of media studies that I'm aware of, where this attention to the way that audiences resist and rework and so on, sort of hegemonic messages, still reiterates the fact that those are hegemonic messages. It says that, there's still a power out there, but then people, prove their agency by reacting to or reading certain ways. There's a scholar of South Asian screen media, William Massarella, who says some, to me, very interesting things about the fact that, all social formations are mediated. Media organize us in all different kinds of ways, whether it's language or anything else. And what we're looking at, many of are the very complex nodes of mediation that bring us together in certain kinds of ways. So my intention, again, was to kind of look at the way that state and global political economic power play in constituting a particular kind of node and what that might mean. So I know that doesn't address in the kind of fine detail people might like those kinds of larger questions about audiences and whether or not I'm painting, the population of Nigeria with too broad a brushstroke. Again, I had no intention of saying all audiences understand Nollywood this way. My intention was to say, this is how Nollywood seems to conceptualize its audience. And as Okome has said, he said one of the things I've done is reiterate the idea that that Nollywood doesn't reflect reality, right? It's a semiotic system. And by the way, Jane Bryce is another person I think who has said this really very well. All of the folks here have said this, but a semiotic system where people work through fantasies and desires and social problems, and so on. I think I'm losing my train of thought at the moment. You know, I'm in Lagos here with the conference organizers, and it's late here. This semiotic system, you know, is where fantasy happens. You know, I don't think of the masculine melodrama necessarily as telling men how to live, and then men actually do that, or it doesn't necessarily reflect the way that women actually think about men or something like that. But it constitutes this fantasy space where people can think through social problems with signs and symbols that aren't from their reality, but that, you know, help them conceptualize those issues some way. That's the kind of way that I feel like I've approached things. You know, I am especially humbled and honored to hear something like, as Dr. Agina said, you know, to have written Nigeria in a way that feels, you know, compelling to a Nigerian reader. I've tried to spend a lot of time working on that, and if I've made even some headway in doing so, that really means a lot to me. And so all of the, certainly the positive things that people have said, you know, just really make me, they're more than I expected, in fact. You know, I thought that I was writing a book that I tried to open up some debates, and I tried to work with certain concepts that weren't even necessarily organic to African studies in certain ways, and that it might, you know, confuse readers or rub them in the wrong way or something. And so I'm really glad to hear the ways that it has connected. And I definitely take to heart the ways that it hasn't connected with certain readers. I do think I will work on some of these issues in the future. But I invite both the audience and other researchers who have certain kinds of agendas and expertise and approaches and so on to, I would love to be, you know, perhaps maybe not excoriated, but written back against, you know, in their work, you know, to test these ideas as folks have said. I think the last comment I'll make here is that on the next celebration of Jonathan Haynes is on the next panel doing that, you know, I intend to talk about the way that he invited us to engage in debates. You know, that there was a time in Nollywood studies where we all had our sort of expeditions into certain areas of what this phenomenon was, and that maybe that time had passed, and we should now really be saying something perhaps a little contentious to try and get the juices flowing for debate. And one of the things that he reiterated in the previous panel celebrating his work, I think came out here, and that I hope is definitely the you know, modus operandi of our field, is that we can do that harmoniously. We can debate with each other, not necessarily against each other. And so I really invite that kind of moving Nollywood forward by saying, you know, this argument only tells half the story, or it needs to be, you know, grappled with in certain ways. And if I was able to get something useful going through debate, I would be very, very happy. So thank you once again to everyone. I really appreciate these comments, and I hope the listeners here and as well as the recording, if it's made available, will show people exactly where they can go to sort of, you know, engage in those debates and pick things apart and take things to the next level. Thank you, everyone, once again.
One of the things I liked about the book is you did, I think more than anyone has, engage in previous readings of Nollywood films. There's been, you know, that's what literature professors do mostly, and there's been a strange lack of it in Nollywood studies. I invite the people who in the audience to submit questions. Ground control says people can raise their hands through the button at the bottom of the screen. I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, and whether people—
There is a question in the discussion box.
Sorry?
There is a question in the discussion box for Mathew, in the chat box. I just saw
it. Okay. My questions relate to the view of Nollywood audiences as participants in the process of the emergence of subjects on screen that indirect subjects presents. I'm wondering if Prof. Brown could speak more about the extent to which an animist imagination, echoing Harry Garuba's animist materialism, participates in our understanding of Nollywood's reconstitution of and mediation of the semiotic system within which its local address operates.
I could say that maybe I deserve that kind of question based on the kind of writing I did in my book, that's maybe slightly opaque at times, and one might need to reread it, a couple of times to make sure one understands. I don't try to write that way, but I understand that I've been told before that it happens sometimes. So this question has parts that I'm not sure I quite understand fully. I know that Harry Garuba essay, but I don't remember it very well. As I remember it, what sticks out to me is a kind of egalitarianism, a kind of, if and correct me if I'm wrong, a sense of a materialism drawn from indigenous, spiritual practices and so on that emphasizes certain kinds of egalitarianism. So I'm not sure if the question here is about, if the mode of address is constituted by power and the audience is over here and they're being invited to participate, if this constitutes some kind of equality somehow, between the two. I don't actually necessarily think that's the case. But what I am interested in is the idea that, certain modes of address, invite the audience into the text in the sense of feeling like they're part of the world that they're watching, right? By the way, there's theorists of Hindi, Hindi film, Bollywood film, that have made kind of similar subjects or similar arguments. The sense that there's a way that the text actually operates, that invites the audience to feel as if they're sort of in that world. What I'm interested in is when the audience is invited into a particular subjectivity, the subjectivity of a particular character, for example, why would the text want them to identify with that one in particular? And I'm, by the way, I'm saying the text. I'm not saying that I know that the director intended it this way or that the cinematographer intended it this way. But once the text exists in front of us, it is remarkable how in something like Living in Bondage, it's only Andy's subjectivity, that the film conventions seem to invite you into, and not other characters on screen. So if it happens consistently with one character, what is that saying? Why would the audience want to be identified with that one person at that one time? And is there anything to make of it? I argue that there are some things to make of it, but maybe that's overstating the case, but that's the question, that I was trying to answer. I hope that addresses your question to some degree.
I'd like to repose some of the issues that Alessandro was bringing up. Something that sometimes troubled me about the book was the sense that, you have a very incisive and kind of elegant mind, and the theory of indirect subjects, of paraliberalism, this is very powerful stuff. But I sometimes felt like it was kind of putting too much in a box. I was reminded of Fred Jameson, was this the 1980s, kind of notoriously declared that third world literature was always an allegory of the colonial, post-colonial situation. And he was taken to task by Ijaz Ahmed and other people who said, actually, if you're coming from India or something like that, that the fullness of that literature, and especially the production that was not in a global language, was in fact about a whole lot of different things. And anyway, Ali put the point very well. I think that there's a Nigerian history, Nigerian reality is so messy, so complicated. There's so many different things going on do you ever worry that your theory was a little bit too complete and too neat?
Yes, I do worry. And I would be, like I said, very open to like, you know, to being sort of repackaged in a certain kind of way. You know, repackaged, reoriented, you know, remixed, or even, you know, resisted. Again, I think I think perhaps, you know, one of my blind spots was that I was fixated to some degree on proceeding from an idea that that the field was to some degree already really good at doing what you're talking about. That there are a lot of us who, you know, and Okome's work with, you know, audiences in the streets and so on, you know, watching films with different kinds of audience and so on. There was a lot already out there that suggested that in some sense it was difficult to locate where power was in this phenomenon, you know, that that there were many things going on, there were many critiques being made, there were many things being held up, many things being torn down and so on. And I guess, you know, what I wanted to try to push forward to see, you know, again, how other scholars would react and how this could, you know, help perhaps the field, is to think about, yes, but are there larger organizing powers that, you know, we should be thinking about, and how do they impinge on Nollywood? And should that be, you know, an important part of our analysis? You know, certainly not the end of the story about our analysis. You know, and I hate the idea that I'm accusing those here of saying you forgot to talk about power. I don't think that's the case. But I just wanted to reorient, to re-insist, I think, on the fact that a lot of this messiness that's going on the ground is still, at least to my mind, structurally determined, you know, by large systems, you know, and that I wanted to try and come up with a language that addressed that, but that was still as attentive as I think I could be. As I hope Dr. Agina said, you know, to some sense of the reality on the ground. So, you know, if that blind spot persists and it still feels nagging, I get that. And I think, you know, I hope that will still push us forward somehow in our field.
We have just 1 or 2 minutes left, but there was one other question that Anulika posed, and somebody from the audience also, you know, seconded, which is, how are people in Nigeria going to read this book?
Yeah.
Now that
Thank
we've
you for that.
Established its importance.
Yeah, I think, and especially I think this would be the group of scholars best positioned, you know, to gauge in the kind of debate I said I'm interested in initiating. So thank you for that. You know, I have so partly this is in play, but I'm not quite sure. So maybe this will be the impetus to do more. I've applied for, you know, some funding from my university to try and pay for open access, you know, to Duke's, you know, through Duke, so that the book can just be widely available. I never presumed that I would have any enough cachet to get like a bookcraft version or something like that done here, you know, but I'd be really happy to talk to anyone about something like that. But anyhow, I'm very interested in those things. I do think they're important, and I will work on that. That's great. And if you contact me, I'd be happy to help you get a copy, by the way, too.
And piracy.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Spending a lot of money, Matthew. I assure you.
What we've all been saying in one way or another is thank you for this book. It's, you know, you've really done a really great job, and you know, the field is very much the better for having this book in it, and congratulations. All right, and thank you to everyone on the panel for having been part of this.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
I think that's it.